王朝海華，菜華 from Dynasty, guys. Oh, by the way, make Kung Fu great again. Make Kung Fu great again. I hope you guys are doing your part making Kung Fu great again. Okay, so in this video, this is a long overdue video. I should have made this video a long time ago. There is something that I wanted to get off my chest for a very long time, and I'm sure the people out there watching this, you will agree with this if you know what I'm talking about. My love-hate relationship with Kung Fu. Okay? I'll tell you where I'm coming from, first of all. For those of you who've been following the videos, heard my podcast, things like that, you know I started Kung Fu like way back in the day, only for a couple months, because this Wing Chun teacher happened to teach Wing Chun out of the Taekwondo school that I was training at. So I tried it for a couple months, and I was curious about it, right? But I never really followed up on it, right? Until, a few years ago, started training the Kung Fu seriously, started getting into the Wing Chun seriously. And as I started training, and as I started interacting and meeting people online about this, martial art or this Kung Fu styles and everything like that, I've met some friends along the way, obviously. There's great people that I've met along the way. So not all people are, bad. There's a lot of good guys out there, a lot of good people out there. But what I have come to realize is that the Kung Fu world or the Kung Fu community was every bit as bad, if not more terrible, than I have assumed that it would be, okay? Because before I did Kung Fu, I would hear about things, from Kung Fu, right? But then usually I stay away from it because I'm a martial artist. I'm a fighter. I compete full contact. I fight full contact fights. I fight MMA. I'm an MMA fighter, right? So usually I would have stayed, far away from, Kung Fu styles and things like that. Not because I didn't like Kung Fu, not because I didn't want to train Kung Fu, but because I knew that there wasn't a whole lot of sparring. There wasn't a whole lot of practical applications to a lot of these old Kung Fu styles, and most of them are just done for movies. Most of them are just done for performances, right? Or even just some are just old and just more of an art form rather than it is a fighting form, right? I just knew that in general, right? I didn't say I had a deep picture of it, but I just knew that in general. So for many years I stayed away from it, right? Until in recent years I grew more appreciative of it, and I want to actually learn it. And I'm like, you know what? Later on, 10 years, 20 years from now, when I'm no longer fighting and stuff like that, I probably want to do Kung Fu. I probably want to do Kung Fu to stay healthy, to, pass it on to others and things like that. So anyway, let's go from what I love about Kung Fu, okay? Before I talk about what I hate about Kung Fu. So let's talk about what I love about Kung Fu first, okay? So obviously Kung Fu is the mother or the father of a lot of martial arts that you know and do today. So it teaches a lot of the foundational basics. It teaches a lot of the foundations, teaches a lot of, the morals and the values, the distance, the timing, the footwork, the structure of your body, right? The strength and conditioning, the stances, everything like that, right? So that's very foundational things, and Kung Fu teaches all those foundational things. And Kung Fu just means Chinese martial arts, by the way. It's not one particular style. Obviously, there's all these other benefits that come from doing Kung Fu. You get to learn about the history. You get to learn about the culture. You get to learn about the many, stories and the legends and things like that, right? Like people telling each other, it's like, oh, this is what happened back in the day, and this is what happened back in the day. And then it goes into, the Hong Kong Kung Fu movie culture as well, right? Like a lot of the Kung Fu movies back in the day that get made, well, even just recent times, that still get made, draw upon these legends and draw upon these stories and myths and stuff like that. It's really cool to kind of like geek out, right? Geek out and get into that Kung Fu culture, get into all the Hong Kong Kung Fu movies and everything like that, from like Shaw Brothers Kung Fu movies to like, Golden Harvest and Bruce Lee and then getting into, Yuen Woo-ping and all of his movies. So it's really, really interesting, right? It's like wuxia movies, right? It's like a whole different world. It's like a fantasy world that you immerse yourself into, right? And it's cool. It's cool to know it, to learn it, and be a part of it, right? Do those moves, right? Do those forms, right? Really, really cool. It's cool to do that stuff. And just like how, you know, in the West, you have Marvel superhero movies and you know, DC universe movies, and you immerse yourself into that universe where it's like, hey, this superhero did this supervillain did this, and all this kind of stuff. Well, in the Kung Fu world, it's the same thing. It's like, oh, I know this style, and you know that style, and we're going to battle it out, and those kinds of things. It's like those legends, right? And obviously the martial arts aspect of it, you know, like learning those punches, learning those kicks, learning those, you know, techniques, those secret kind of techniques that Kung Fu, you know, has deeply, you know, stored into all of its forms, right? All of its tolos, its patterns, right? There's so much deep knowledge there. There's a deep appreciation there, right? And really, it's rare to find like a Kung Fu master to really be able to teach you, right? Because there's a lot of, I don't want to get into that just yet, right? I'll get into that later, but it's hard to find those real Kung Fu masters, right? But if you do find a Kung Fu master, like, hold on to that person, because, man, they've got a wealth of knowledge. They got a wealth of knowledge, right? Anyways, from martial arts aspect to the training to the fitness to obviously the fighting aspects, Sanda and Kung Fu, and you see those techniques in MMA and all those kinds of things. That's what I love about Kung Fu, obviously, because it's very old and it's got a wide range of you know, knowledge, striking, grappling, throwing, all those kinds of things. It's like very, very deep knowledge, right? And all the weapons too, all the weapons applications and how to use the weapons and stuff like that. It's just so many things to learn. It's so deep, right? It's just like BJJ. Kung Fu is just like Jiu-Jitsu. It's like, it's so deep. It's going to take a lifetime to learn, right? And I'm very excited to be, you know, on that journey of continuing to train my Kung Fu. Now, let's get to the part where I hate, okay? I don't hate a whole lot of things, but this is what I hate about Kung Fu. And it's about the Kung Fu community. It's not about Kung Fu itself. I love Kung Fu, but I hate the Kung Fu community. Why do I hate the Kung Fu community? There's so many things to talk about the Kung Fu community that is so, you know, negative, right? And I want to share that because it needs to be said. Why I hate the Kung Fu community is that once I joined, you know, some of these online Kung Fu forums, these message boards and things like that, what I realized is, and I kind of already knew this going into it, so 90% of these Kung Fu people are full of shit. Are absolutely full of shit. It's laughable for a guy like me who's like a mixed martial arts fighter, or even if I don't fight, I train full contact, I compete, you know, I train with other pro fighters and stuff like that. So I know what martial arts is. I've done so many styles at this point. I have multiple black belts, and I continue to, you know, study and train and compete. So when it comes to these Kung Fu people in the Kung Fu community, 90%, if not 99% of these guys are frauds. They're full of shit. They don't know what they're talking about. They're just making stuff up along the way. And it is absolute rubbish. It is absolute garbage, okay? So let me tell you why they're garbage. 90% of these Kung Fu guys, they say they've trained for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever. Literally doesn't matter. Because the reason why it doesn't matter is because, one, they've never competed against anybody doing anything. They've never fought. They've never even sparred. You know, they don't even spar with their martial arts. How the hell are they supposed to know that their Kung Fu works, okay? All they keep talking about is their theories and their stances, and, you know, your technique is wrong because of this, you know, my Sifu said that, you know, your theory is wrong, like, historically, this wasn't how it was used, blah, 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 okay? Any kind of bull crap that they want to throw at you, they'll throw at you, okay? So they constantly critique, you know, that you've got the wrong technique. They constantly critique that you've got the wrong stance. They constantly say that, you know, this is not how you do it, that. It is an endless stream of bullshit from these Kung Fu guys. And why do they do this? I know exactly why they do this. It's like being a geek in any kind of subject matter, okay? Like, you could be a Star Wars geek. You could be a Dungeons and Dragons geek. Well, this is what you would call a Kung Fu geek. They've trained Kung Fu for that long, right? So they feel as if they are an expert at it, right? but their expertise is basically based on nothing. All right, their expertise is based on, you know, fantasy, right? They're basically experts at something that has no real world value, right? And I'm not talking about all Kung Fu people. I'm talking about like 90% of them, okay? So they get so geeky into this crap that in relation to the real world, where, you know, the real world, let's say, you know, has science to prove, you know, what things work or what doesn't, right? And we have like MMA fights or whatever, full contact fights to prove, pressure test what works and what doesn't, right? So these people are kind of like religious fanatics or whatever you want to call it, right? They're just so, you know, deeply ingrained with their religion that they have no relationship with the real world, where it's based on facts, it's based on science, it's based on proof. Nothing. These people are like religious fanatics in their, you know, cults, in their cults, where they just gather around and they just say cultish things to each other. They're like, you know, this technique was like that, and, you know, I would beat you like this, and ha, 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 you know, I would beat you like that. And then they never actually prove anything that they do works. Never. So they just stay around in their own little cult, right? Their own little, excuse my language, their own little, you know, circle jerk kind of cult. And it's like basically kids playing with sandcastles. I don't know if any other term can describe it properly, but it's like kids playing with sandcastles. It's like they ignore everything that's happening in the outside world. It's like, okay, you've got guys winning fights in boxing, you've got guys doing full contact Muay Thai kickboxing fights. And then you have, like, you know, the best fighters in the world doing MMA fights, you know, UFC champions and stuff like that. And then Kung Fu guys, you know, the Kung Fu community, 90% of them ignore what's happening out there, and they say crazy-ass things. They say crazy things like, oh, you know, that's not a real fight. Oh, yeah, it's a sport fight, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I get it. Kung Fu is mostly applicable for the streets because it's a bare-knuckle fighting art, all that kind of stuff. I get it. I know that. I'm a Kung Fu practitioner. I get what you're saying. But a lot of these Kung Fu guys ignore the reality side of it. It's like, hey, doesn't matter if your Kung Fu is great for the street or whatever. If you don't pressure test and you don't actually spar full contact, you're not as good as you think you are. You know what I mean? Like, you know, a professional fighter would just kick your ass. You know, it doesn't matter if he's, you know, training with gloves on and shin guards on and whatever. Like, he has proven it in the ring time and time and time again. Your street fighting art is not going to be able to withstand some guy that trains like a professional and fights like a professional. But anyway, that's the obvious part, right? That's the obvious stuff. There are other guys out there, these Kung Fu guys, that act like Kung Fu gatekeepers, right? Kung Fu gatekeepers are the worst. So number one is the Kung Fu geeks, the guys that geek out about the details of the Kung Fu, and then they use that as sort of a tactic where they can talk down on other people and say like, oh, you don't know this. And then there's the Kung Fu gatekeepers, like usually the older guys who have studied the arts for so long. They feel like they're in an authoritative position to be like, well, you know, don't come into Kung Fu and think you can do this. You know, don't come into Kung Fu and think that you're cocky and you could say these things. It's like, that's disrespectful. That's disrespectful to my art and my lineage and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's like, if you ever met up with me and you touched hands with me, you will feel, you know, my power and my energy right away. And I'm just like, no, you won't, because you're old, first of all. You've never fought, by the way. And it doesn't matter how good, you know, your skills are Kung Fu-wise. You take a young guy that's been fighting combat sports, even at an amateur level, against a guy who's never fought full contact. The guy that's going to fight full contact is going to win. It doesn't matter how many years you've trained in your Kung Fu. Like, you never sparred. You never fought. So none of that stuff matters. So the Kung Fu, not to go into, you know, a 3-hour rant about this, but basically the Kung Fu community, right? 90% of the Kung Fu community is so far removed from reality. okay? Because they're so hell-bent on their dogmatic tradition, right? They're so hell-bent on their traditional training and their traditional this and traditional that. But they're not able to bridge the gap. They're not able to take their traditional training, bridge it, and be like, okay, now I'm going to apply it in a modern way. Which, by the way, I'm not saying I'm the only one who does it, but I'm saying I do that with my Kung Fu training, right? I take my knowledge of the stances, I take my knowledge of the forms, and obviously with the knowledge of my teacher who teaches me, and I go like, oh, okay, well, in a fighting scenario, I'm going to use it like this, you know? I'm going to hit him like this, you know? I'm going to hit him like that, you know? I'm going to, you know, hit him like this, right? Like immediately I'm thinking how to apply it, you know, in a fighting scenario, in a combat sports scenario. Whereas 90% of these Kung Fu guys, they don't do that. They're just like, oh, well, you know, hey, you know, I'm good at this. Therefore, you know, that's real fighting. Like, I would kill you. I would kill you, you know, because I'm really good at doing this. I will kill you. And it's like, it's insane. It's insanity. It's like me talking to someone. It's like me trying to explain sex to a virgin. It's like, you've never had sex before? Again, excuse my language, but you've never had sex before? You don't know what it feels like. I can't explain what that feels like to you. It's like explaining real fighting to a person who's never fought. How would you know? You are too stupid to even know. You are too ignorant to even know. And I've wasted plenty of time talking to people like this, trying to figure out exactly, hey, are you actually serious about what you're saying? And I realized everything is true. They actually are insane. They actually are crazy. They actually believe what they think. You know, I would talk to them and I'd be like, oh, I realized that you're not actually trolling. You're not trolling. You're actually just that stupid. These people, these Kung Fu, you know, community people, 90% of these guys, they're so stupid that they actually think that they're right, right? And that is the worst kind of stupid, is that when you talk to somebody and you're like, hey, you know, watch this, you know, MMA fight or UFC fight or whatever. And then that guy will be like, oh, well, that's actually not a real fight. You know, that doesn't take any skill, you know? Like, you know, you should watch, you know, real masters, you know, do this and do that. Like, I would end the fight in 3 seconds. And then you just get into that territory where it's like, okay, whatever, I can't talk to you anymore. So basically, in conclusion, that is my love-hate relationship with Kung Fu. And I constantly go back and forth between loving Kung Fu and hating Kung Fu because of these two factors, right? Because when I train my Kung Fu and I develop my Kung Fu and I get better at it and stuff like that, I try to talk to, you know, some of my Kung Fu friends and be like, hey, how do you feel about this? It's like, hey, I got to this level where, you know, I'm doing it like this now. It's like, what do you think, right? And then all of that is muddled, okay, with all this other bull crap that other people will try and feed you. Bad information, bad news, right? Basically fake news. Like, they'll try and feed you this information. They'll say things like, well, you know, you got to be careful, you know. I'm just like, I got to shut that crap off. You know what I mean? My love-hate relationship is like, it bounces between the two, okay? So in conclusion, I now, you know, ignore people that don't have any proof of whatever they're saying. If they've never fought, I don't listen to them, okay? I only listen to the people that have fought, or I listen to the people that are actually experienced in what they're teaching, okay? They've done it for 30 years and they've got proof that their shit works. They've got proof that their Kung Fu works. Usually they have good sparring videos of them, or they have good live videos of them applying their skills, or they have videos of their students kicking ass. Those are the only people I listen to. The rest of the stuff, I freaking ignore because it's garbage. It's full of gatekeeping type of language and crap. And it's just crap spewed by cultists and their cult followers, right? That literally is what it is. It's these pockets of cults by these cult leaders, these YouTube masters, these YouTube sifus with, like, you know, tens of thousands of subscribers. And they believe in whatever they say. They believe in it like it's the gospel, like it's the cult, right? As Bruce Lee said, right? You know, these classical arts are in a fancy mess because everybody just believes that whatever they're saying is the gospel and that they're right. And these cultish, you know, these cult members are just ridiculous. I just don't listen to them. I just tune them off. So that is my solution, okay? As I'm going forward into training Kung Fu, I'm only going to focus on my training, my Kung Fu, and I'm only going to focus on the people that are actually good and I ignore all the haters, ignore all the cult members, ignore all the geeks and the freaks and the gatekeeper masters that have 0 fights on their record, right? Never fought, right? I never listened to these guys. These guys are trash, right? And that's it. That's my love-hate relationship with Kung Fu. Hope you got something out of that. And like and share if you agree.